Okay, so I guess we might as well get started. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us in this WISE lecture. I guess we have a few people online. We're hoping to get more people live, but a few of you show up, so I appreciate that. Some of you actually got lunch if you're in. I think there's still lunch out there. So I see. So I see. So thank you for being here. In this talk, we're going to have Professor Daniel Olivares talking about his research in terms of introducing the center that he's associated with, and also the work he's been doing in different aspects of optimization and pathways to basically renewables and decarbonization. He's an associate professor in the Faculty of Engineering and Science at the University Adolfo Ibáñez University. He's director also of the Center for Energy Transition, CENTRA. I guess that's an English acronym, right? CENTRA. Both works. And he's also an adjunct associate professor here in our department, EC department, University of Waterloo. He has 12 years, more than 12 years of experience in different aspects of research in terms of technical economic analysis of electrical systems in the electrical sector at the national and international levels. And he got a degree in civil electrical engineering. It's a particular, I guess, name that is used in Chile, which I haven't seen anywhere else. But anyway, it has to do with electrical engineering at the University of Chile, and a PhD in our department. He's my former student. And he's visiting us for a few weeks. Thank you for the visit. We're trying to establish a MOU with the university and Centra, which is because of the synergies between WISE and Centra, which we're quite interested in taking advantage of, exploring, hopefully for the benefit of both institutions. He's an associate researcher at the Solar Energy Research Center, CERC in Chile, and an associate researcher at the Complex Engineering Systems Institute in Chile as well. His research focuses on development of control schemes, computational models, and tools for the efficient operational planning of sustainable energy systems. Most of his research focuses on energy management systems for microgrids, in which he did a lot of pioneering work, and led a paper that has become, is the most cited paper in the transaction of smart grid, by the way. So we were quite successful with that work. He has been also a consultant, various technical, economic, and regulatory aspects in Chile, working with the Ministry of Energy, the National Energy Commission, and the National Electrical Coordinator in Chile, as well as working with international organizations, GIZ. What is GIZ? Oh, okay. And the World Bank. Okay, Daniel, floor is yours. Thank you for visiting us.
Thank you, Claudio, for the introduction. It's always nice to come back to Waterloo. Yeah, it's the first time my daughter is going to see me speaking in public. Well, I was told a few minutes earlier that 2 years ago when I offered a talk, that was some of the last talks offered in public before the pandemic. So now a reopening session, I guess. So the talk I'm going to offer is about a study it's a model, state-of-the-art planning model that we developed, and then we use it to analyze decarbonization pathways for Chile. And this work has been very impactful in the sense that the Ministry of Energy has taken our results to promote new public policy in Chile. But first, let me tell you a little bit about, there we go, a little bit about Centra, which is a new research center we just launched earlier this year at the Adolfo Ibáñez University. Actually, our university closed all the centers 2 years ago because a new mandate from the president of the university was to create centers that were very much much more connected with the local industry and private and public sectors. So they asked us to reformulate all the centers to comply with this mandate. Centra wasn't existing before that, but was created with this mandate, and our mission is to therefore conduct and transfer interdisciplinary research that allows society to advance energy transitions toward economical, environmentally friendly, and socially acceptable and reliable energy demand and supply. And we aim at becoming a national and international benchmark in applied research for the generation and transfer of solutions to global energy challenges and public policies that favor the development of sustainable energy sector. We actually, after launching the center, we gathered a group of researchers that, if you look at the metrics in terms of impact in research, we are nowadays the most impactful group of researchers in Chile, which is in my view is quite a good news, because we have a couple of research centers with more than 10 years experience in Chile at the University of Chile and the Catholic University of Chile. And to be at that level so quickly is good news for us. So we organized our research based on multidisciplinary challenges. We think this is important because instead of focusing on areas of expertise, we focused on grand challenges for energy transition. And these are mostly based on the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. One of our focus is clean fuels. Chile, a couple of years ago, launched a national strategy to develop a supply chain for green hydrogen. We are expected to have the lowest cost of production of green hydrogen in a few years from now, basically because of our great renewable potential. Of course, there are more costs to be added to the production, which are transport to the main consumers, which are most likely going to be in Europe and North America. But there are many techno-economic challenges to be solved there. Our second area is sustainable and resilient energy supply. As you may know, one of the big challenges for electricity and energy supply in general from climate change is that it's going to be much more stressed, subject to seasons of extreme weather, also severe droughts, as the one that we're experiencing in Chile for more than 10 years. So we need to build a energy supply system that is resilient against these stresses. Also, sustainable industry 4.0. We have many researchers in our group working on a conversion of processes to green fuels, and sustainable energy in cities and communities. This is basically motivated by my research line on microgrids, but also extends to social aspects of integrating renewables at the local scale. This is our current base of members. They are all faculty members at UAI. Most of us are with the Faculty of Engineering and Sciences, but some of us are also with the Faculty of Business School, which is quite well known in Latin America. Actually, it was the first business school in Latin America, the UAI Business School. And the expertise of our members is either in regulation of markets, modeling of energy systems, and some of our researchers also work on developing prototypes for energy production. So our strategy to achieve our goals we have a wide variety of activities, but I just want to concentrate on the first two. The first one is the Centra Industrial Researchers Program, which actually I borrowed the name from Canada, which you guys are used to. You, Claudio, yourself, you are a chair with Hydro One. The question we had, or the hypothesis, was that there were questions in the industry, medium-term questions to be solved, and nobody was addressing them because there's no capabilities inside the companies in Chile to develop that kind of research to answer those questions. And the academia didn't have the programs to address those questions. So we created the program. The idea is to approach companies, help them formulate the question that they want to solve, and then create an applied research for a period of 2 to 3 years to aim at solving them, and at the same time do research and train new students. We started the program right away. We got a company involved, which is a company involved in the distributed generation business. And we have conversations with the Ministry of Energy nowadays, and with another company that wants to start the program like this. They are interested both in the results, but also in the training capabilities of our team, so that they can hire after our graduates. And the second project is the UAI Intelligent and Carbon Neutral Campus by 2030, which is a university-wide project. The idea would be to create living labs for training of students, but also professionals that are getting into the business of sustainability or sustainable energy. And also to, of course, that is of interest of the university to make savings as well in operational costs. Okay, so that was about Centra. So now let me give you a brief introduction about the challenge that we try to solve with this planning model for Chile. First, it's no surprise to the audience, I guess, that we are currently undergoing one of the most dramatic changes in climate that humanity has faced. Most scientific evidence points at the increasing green gas emissions due to human activity. And in this context, the energy sector, not only electricity sector, but the energy sector plays a major role, accounting for nearly 70% of the total human-produced CO2 emissions worldwide. In Chile, actually, it's higher. The energy sector accounts for 78% of the total CO2 emissions, and coal, the use of coal, accounts for nearly 40% of our electricity generation mix. So it's a big player in CO2 emissions. That's why the government pushed forward a decarbonization schedule. But now in Chile, what we call decarbonization schedule is basically phasing out coal. It's not just phasing out all CO2 emissions. It's just coal, but we run some studies as well, seeing what happens if we decarbonize or make it 100% renewable in some of our sensitivities. But just to be clear, when I call in this presentation decarbonization schedule, I mean phasing out coal in Chile, in Chile electricity production. So this goal has become increasingly challenging due to the severe drought that Chile is facing since 2010, which has significantly reduced the contribution of hydropower plants. So if we go back maybe 20 or 30 years in Chile, we would see that hydropower represented nearly 60% of electricity production. Nowadays is between 20 and 25%, because we're not building new hydropower plants, but also because the existing ones have much lower plant factors because of the drought. And actually, by 2020, the precipitation that we observed in Chile was 20 to 45% of the average nationally on the all-time records, right? And in Santiago, we averaged between 10 to 20% of the average precipitation over the whole horizon that we have records. So it's a very extreme drought. So this process of phasing out coal then poses several questions. These are all valid questions that are being asked by many politicians and journalists in Chile all the time. Are we going too fast? Are we trying to phase out coal too fast, and therefore we're paying too much for this, and it's not necessary? Are we risking security of supply because of phasing out coal so fast? We actually had this concern earlier this year because we decommissioned 2 large coal-based power plants, and because of the drought, the independent system operator estimated that there was a significant chance of facing insufficiency in electricity supply. So some politicians were trying to go back and relaunch the power plants, but that was not possible. or maybe we should be going faster. So maybe this is not fast enough. Maybe we should be going even farther from, like, even beyond carbon or coal phased out, and also be looking at gas. Anyway, so all these questions are basically cannot be addressed from a single perspective, are largely, in my opinion, a matter of political consensus. However, there is some questions that we can formulate from academia that can help the discussions in this area. For example, the question that we try to answer is, how do different decarbonization pathways impact the Chilean electricity system in terms of operational features and costs? Okay, so this will inform policy decisions. So in what follows, I will discuss the methodology and models that we used and the case studies that we formulate to try to answer this question. But first, let me tell you about this strong connection, strong link that needs to be represented in any planning model that tries to forecast what's going to happen with decarbonization, which is the connection between decarbonizing our electricity systems and providing flexibility, right? So in Chile, as I mentioned, decarbonizing or phasing out coal is a significant challenge because currently it represents for 40% of the generation mix. If we look at 2020, we could see that nearly 40% of the generation in a year is coal. So together with this decommissioning of coal generation, we also see a significant growth of renewable energy sources, which are expected to support the emission reduction. And the combination of these two create need for flexibility, right? Because we have fast ramping up and down variations during the day, seasonal variations in availability of renewables. But if we don't have coal and we don't have gas, if we extend the argument, then we're not going to be able to deal with such variability, right? We need to be able to store energy, either as a fossil fuel or energy storage, to be able to compensate for these variations in renewables, which are the sources that are going to support our transition towards low emission systems. So flexible technologies such as storage can play a crucial role in the reliability of this decarbonization process. However, if we look at the typical modeling available for planning purposes, we don't see constraints representing flexibility. Like, flexibility is typically associated with operational constraints. And if you look at most planning models, they don't even use hourly time resolution. They just use energy blocks. So there's no way of seeing flexibility constraints in classical planning models. So this is how we address the question. First, we employed a state-of-the-art expansion planning model. I'll tell you more about it in a few slides, to analyze basically 3 base decarbonization scenarios considering flexibility requirements. The phase one, the first scenario is phasing out coal by 2040, which is the current policy in Chile. And then we also tested 2 accelerated decarbonization scenarios, which are the D35, decarbonizing by 2035, and D30, which is decarbonizing by 2030. So our expansion planning models allows us to determine the optimal transition of the Chilean power system through planning horizon between 2020 and 2040 for different decarbonization goals, in particular those 3, based on a mathematical representation of the investment decisions and operational dynamics over such horizon. So basically what our model does is to decide when, what, and where to build generation units and transmission lines. And in terms of operational decisions, it decides how much to generate, which are the power flows over the lines in the transmission system, and other operational variables to meet expected demand in order to estimate operational costs. And I'm going to give you more details about that in a minute. So our expansion model models planning and operation, and was an extension of the switch model, which is a planning model developed at UC Berkeley, maybe 10 years ago. It was oriented to the energy sector in general, not only electricity. So it had a very rough modeling of the electricity production and transport and consumption, I would say. We worked on that model with several master and PhD students, and we managed to upgrade it to include representative days, modeling of storage facilities, detailed modeling of concentrated solar power plants. That's all uploaded to the switch model that you can find now in their website. So if you go to the switch model website and download, which is an open source model, you will see many of the upgrades that we developed for this project throughout almost 5 years. So the model determines the optimal investment decisions from a central planner perspective in a long-term horizon. We can use 30 years, we use 20 years in this case, but it's highly customizable, right? This is important to say. In Chile, generation is not planned centrally, right? It's an investor decision, it's a private decision. Anyway, all the countries that have a private generation market, they still use these planning models because they help us determine which is supposed to be the efficient mix of generation. And then it helps us to redesign our markets so that the trajectory that we follow with the centralized decision from investors looks like the efficient track, right? Our model is capable of capturing short-term dynamics with high level of detail, including a relaxed representation of the unit commitment constraints, which are based on a partial convex hull relaxation. Right? Basically, we took the unit commitment constraints, which tell us when we turn on a unit, how much time we have to keep it on until we can turn it off, and vice versa. Of course, those involved binary variables, which are not desirable in a model this large. So we relaxed the binary condition of those variables, and we included a couple of extra constraints that are valid constraints in a sense that they are still a relaxation of the original problem. And these are based on the convex hull relaxation that was presented in a paper 4 or 5 years ago. Each planning stage is represented by a number of representative days with hourly resolution, which allows us to represent reserve requirements, the hydro network, and short-term storage. And we have detailed models for thermal and battery energy storage systems. We have a model of the Chilean network. This is Chile cut in 3 pieces. I have to put them all together to see Chile, but there is actually a few thousand kilometers south of this point. This is Puerto Montt, which is the southern end of the Chilean central electricity system. Right? We have a few medium-sized electricity systems south of that, but this is the main system. We model Chile with 20 nodes or load zones, which is actually the standard way of modeling Chile for this type of studies by the National Energy Commission or the Ministry of Energy. This is not a toy model. This is state of the art with the actual size of the system. We have a generation fleet of 137 existing units and 209 candidate units to be installed over the horizon. In terms of the transmission system, we have 23 transmission corridors with candidate expansions, each of them. The hydro network is very tricky and it has to be modeled because it poses several operational constraints to the Chilean electricity system operation. In particular, it's very connected in a sense that you have a whole basin of a river with several power production facilities downstream, and the production of all these facilities are of course linked because the water that you use to generate upstream is the same water that then is available for generation downstream. So there's a time coupling in the operation of this system that needs to be represented. And there are also what we call the irrigation agreements, which tell us how much of the water available each year we can use for actual power production. and how much we have to save in the dams because of irrigation purposes. Okay, if we were to plan or to operate the system without accounting for these constraints in the hydropower network, we would see results that don't make sense for the actual, for practical purposes in Chile. So all these modeling approaches and case studies that I sort of mentioned in the past slides are reported in several papers and theses over the last 5 years. Some of them are here. I don't think I included all of them. So it's a model that has been tested thoroughly, reported in literature, and also used for real case studies for the industry. Some additional key features of our model: we use a clustering technique based on dynamic time warping to determine 6 representative days for each planning period. These are, for example, the days that resulted from this clustering. So the January 31st represents a cluster of 67 days that are similar to that according to this metric, which is the dynamic time warping metric. For demand and renewable profiles were obtained from real data from the Chilean independent system operator, and for future planning periods, the load was increased in the same shape by a growth factor. And renewables, we also ran several sensitivities with different growth factors. I'm not going to show all the sensitivities that we ran, but we did a very thorough sensitivity analysis. And we also, the renewable profiles remain unchanged over the horizon. So we assume that the pattern of renewable production is going to be the same. We just increase the capacity. We included these flexibility constraints, which in specific means we included ramping constraints for our units. We included minimum stable levels, for which it's a relaxed constraints for minimum stable limits, because to actually represent minimum stable limits, you need a binary variable to decide whether the unit is on or off, right? So if it's on, it has to be more than 50 megawatts or so. If it's off, it can be 0. And we also represented these minimum up and minimum down times constraints for thermal units. These figures on the right side show us a sensitivity that we ran. These are actual results from the model. So the blue line shows us what would happen, what the model would do if we didn't represent these flexibility constraints. So the model is operating this combined cycle gas turbine very flexibly, right? It goes to maximum power, then it turns it off, then it turns it on 5 hours later and at maximum power and so on, if we don't account for those flexibility constraints. If we do, in a relaxation, of course, it's not exact representation, we see the green line, where we can see that the unit, for example, in this valley, is not turned off. It goes to minimum power, because it cannot be turned off if you want to turn it on a few hours later. Okay, so this somehow accounts for the fact that these units are not very flexible. You cannot turn them on and off during the day at will. We used a variety of sources, official sources from the government and the independent system operator, to determine which are the sets of candidate generation units and candidate transmission lines. These are very realistic set of possible investment decisions. We set the starting planning horizon at 2020 for this study, and we used 6 periods of 4 years. So we made investment decisions every 4 years. We have 6 periods to cover the whole horizon. 5 periods go from 2020 to 2040, and then we had a complementary period from 2040 to 2044 in order to avoid these end period effects that sometimes you see. If you end at 2040, then the investment decisions 2040 don't make sense, because there's no future to plan for, right? All models were solved using Gurobi. So let me show you the results, what we obtained. This is a breakdown of costs for each of the 3 decarbonization. Remember, this is phasing out coal strategies by 2040, 2035, and 2030. In terms of total costs, we can end up paying, like, for the actual decarbonization schedule now is 43.67 billion. These all numbers are in billion dollars net present value in 2020, right? So it can cost us nearly 3 billion extra if we want to accelerate decarbonization and do it by 2030. We would also end up spending much more money on new generation because we have to accelerate the investments, have to do investments in generation much earlier, which are going to impact more in the net present value, of course. We end up paying much more. We didn't see much of a difference in terms of transmission assets. Investment is mostly the same. And well, in terms of generation fuel consumption, of course, if we decarbonize earlier, we get lower costs. This is the capacity mix that we observed in the 3 decarbonization scenarios. So in this one, for example, we see that coal, which is the gray bar, disappears in 2028. By 2032, we don't see coal in this scenario. In this one, which is decarbonizing by 2035, it disappears in 2032. And the other one is by 2040. We also see that all scenarios consider a significant growth in variable photovoltaics and wind capacity. Photovoltaics is the yellow segment, and wind is the light gray. And also we see that this increase in variable renewables motivates new entrants of CSP, which is combined solar power, which goes with thermal storage, and batteries, which is, let me see which ones are the batteries. Oh, batteries is the first one. So they start to appear as we increase the penetration of variable renewables, but mostly CSP. This was actually an interesting result because in all the previous analysis, CSP wasn't a big player in the future energy mix in Chile. This was the first study, and mainly because of modeling the flexibility requirements, that CSP started to show up in the future energy mix. This CSP is combined, concentrated solar power. This is in terms of the investment track in terms of money, not capacity. So we can see that if we want to accelerate, we have to spend much more money in 2028, of course, because we have to replace coal earlier, and that impacts the net present value for alternative significantly. For all the scenarios, we can see that investment in variable sources is balanced with flexible gas. So gas plays a role, a significant role in 2036 and 2040, because we cannot get rid of it if we don't impose it, because it's a flexible resource that's going to help us manage variability of renewables. And also CSP and batteries, which are the other highly flexible resources available in the system. So in gas, we see, when we see gas, it represents gas turbines, which are very flexible, but also combined cycle gas power plants, which are, because of the steam turbine, are not that flexible, especially the steam turbine. This is in terms of generation mix. So we see that CSP, in all the cases, plays a significant role by 2040, which is the sort of orange or salmon color. PV is not that big though. So we would expect that PV in Chile would be much bigger player in the future, but we're not seeing that. The reason why we're not seeing that is because it's far from the load center. So it involves a higher investment in transmission, but also because it requires a lot of storage to handle intraday variations, day-to-night variations in PV. That's not the case with wind, where it's more like, it's still variable, but more stable throughout the day. So we see more wind than PV integrated in the Chilean generation mix. This is the difference in the generation mix that we see in 2020 and in 2040 for the scenario where we decarbonize by 2040, so phasing out coal by 2040. What we see here is a large increase in variable renewable energy. It grows 14.3% of the total generation mix. So basically PV from 7.1 to 11.7 and wind from 11.3 to 21.0. We also observe a large decrease in fossil fuel generation because we are phasing out coal. Of course, we see a drop of almost 30%, mainly because of the coal generation reduction. We also see a decrease in hydro dam generation because we are not building new hydro dam power plants in the horizon, so proportionally represents a much lower, much smaller fraction of the total generation. And we also observe small increases in hydro run-of-river generation, which are still a few basins that we can use for that in Chile. This is the power system operation in 2020. You see, for example, in several days, you can see that coal represented almost even 50% of the generation. Some of the sun, PV solar generation was appearing here, and it was basically compensated, the variation was compensated by gas power plant. For example, here, gas appears right after the peak of solar to compensate during night. So I guess we can see from this that the big challenge next after phasing out coal is going to be phasing out gas because it's providing a large share of the flexibility that we require. Okay, and this is how 2040 would look like in the scenario where we phase out coal by 2040. Right? So there's no coal generation in this slide. We can see that PV is a very significant resource during daytime. We can also see that CSP production is very stable throughout the day. Basically, CSP replaced coal as a base load generation because of the thermal storage capabilities. Hydro run-of-river is also significant. And we can see also a hydro dam role that is not the one that was playing 10 years ago, which was a base load generation. Now is becoming a contributor to power system flexibility. So it stores energy during the day, and then at night, it provides the power that PV solar is not longer contributing. This is a thermal storage cycle in 2040. In the scenario where we phase out coal by 2040, we see that thermal storage further emphasizes the role of CSP in providing carbon-free baseload generation by 2040. It's being charged during sun hours and then discharged power during the whole day. So this is production, and this is energy storage, thermal energy storage. And this is how CO2 emissions look like in the three scenarios. So this is the one where we decarbonize by 2040. If we decarbonize by 2035, drops much faster, and by 2030 also. So we see that the main CO2 emissions nowadays in Chile are carbon. So the policy is right by phasing out coal generation first. But the next one is gas. And an interesting thing we observe here is that if we don't do nothing, then we reach record low CO2 emissions from the electricity sector in 2036. But then in 2040, we start seeing an increase because gas production starts increasing to accommodate more renewables. So let me show you now what happens if we didn't model flexibility. So these are the results of the state-of-the-art model with flexibility modeling, but what happened if we didn't model flexibility, which was what everybody was doing in Chile right before we launched this study. So we tried 3 different scenarios, which are D40 minus, D35 minus, and D30 minus. The difference of those is only that in those scenarios, we relaxed all the operational constraints that represented flexibility constraints. That means no ramping constraints, no minimum power constraints, and no minimum up and down constraints. So first, in terms of cost, of course, our model without modeling those constraints is a relaxed model. So it's gonna end up being cheaper in the model. That doesn't mean that when we actually operate the system under those conditions, it's expected to be higher, right? The model tells us that it's lower because we have less constraints. In terms of generation investment, we also see that our model with the relaxed flexibility constraints tend in the scenario D40 to invest more. We will see that that is because it overestimates the capability of the system to integrate PV, right? Because it doesn't account for flexibility constraints, so it thinks that it can integrate more PV than it actually can efficiently. Okay, so let me show you a more interesting figure, I guess, which is the generation mix in D40 versus D40 minus. So this is the generation mix that we would observe if we do model flexibility constraints. And this is what the model tells us if we don't model flexibility constraints. So first, we see that PV is much lower in the scenario where we do model flexibility as compared with the scenario where we don't, right? Because the variability is not being compensated properly in this scenario. This scenario thinks that power plants can do whatever they want, go up and down, turn on and off anytime. Gas also is much lower in the scenario where we don't model flexibility constraints, because the model thinks they don't need that much gas because they can turn it off during daylight times, right? But in actually, you cannot turn those units off if you want to use them later at night. That means that you have to keep them on producing gas-fired power, and that means that you have a higher level of integration or participation of gas in the generation mix. The model also thinks that it doesn't need that much CSP, because why do we need CSP if we have gas and we can turn it on and off flexibly? So CSP is still a large player, but not that big compared to the case where we do model flexibility constraints. This is the difference between scenarios D40 and D40 minus, so with and without modeling flexibility constraints, in terms of the combined cycle gas turbines throughout the 6 representative days in 2040. So we see that scenario D40 minus, which is the darker green, turns on and off the unit during the day, goes up, goes down, no ramping constraints, no minimum and up and down constraints, so very flexible. Actually, when we model this in a relaxed way, we see that generation is more stable throughout the day because you cannot play with the unit that fast. In terms of CSP, we also see that when we do model flexibility constraints, we gave the model three alternatives for CSP thermal storage. One was 17 hours thermal storage, 13 hours thermal storage, and 9 hours thermal storage. So the choice in the model where flexibility wasn't an issue is that 13 hours was the perfect storage capacity, because it's exactly the time where we don't have sun mostly, right? So we just need to accommodate the sun that we generate during daytime to nighttime. But when we do model flexibility, that means that we have to be doing this with CSP, then we require more shorter term energy storage, which is the 9-hour energy storage, which we don't observe when we don't model flexibility, right? So the efficient decision when we do model flexibility is to have shorter term energy storage to accommodate for this intraday variability. And then we said, okay, what happens if we go 100% renewable? Are we doing okay in time?
Yeah, we're running out of time.
Okay, just 5 minutes. Perfect. Okay. So what happens if we go towards 100% renewable energy mix? So what we did is to create 3 new scenarios, D40 star, D35 star, and D30 stars, which are phasing out coal by 2040, 2035, and 2030, but also imposing 100% renewable generation constraint by 2040 in all of the scenarios. Right? So decarbonizing by phasing out coal by the corresponding time, but then 100% renewable energy mix by 2040. And what we observed is that, of course, imposing 100% renewable is going to cost us money. For example, if we aim to phase out coal by 2040, but also making it 100% renewable, it costs us $670 million. It's not that much in net present value. So imposing that constraint is not that expensive. It's actually a reasonable constraint, we believe, to impose a target for 100% renewable by 2040. In terms of generation investments, of course, involves more money because we're not just phasing out coal, but also gas, which was a significant player in all the solutions in the base cases. So the role of solar PV is significantly reduced in the case where we impose 100% renewable. Why is that? Because here we had the gas to compensate. If we don't have the gas, then we cannot integrate the PV reliably. And that means that we need solar plus storage, which is cheaper when we combine them in a concentrated solar power. These results might change quite a bit if we assume a different trend of cost for electrochemical storage, energy storage, right? Because we can also have a combination of PV plus ESS, which would fulfill the same role as CSP, right? So these are highly sensitive to those assumptions, but we do need a lot of storage if we wanna be 100% renewable. And this is what happens in terms of CO2 emissions. So in this case, we reduced coal much faster in the case of D30, right? By 2032, we don't have coal emissions, CO2 emissions coming from coal. We still do have some gas, but it drops down to 0 in all the scenarios because that's what we imposed in the end. Okay, so let me tell you a few final remarks. First, the decarbonization of electricity system process creates key challenges in terms of procurement and operation of flexible resources, as we could observe. Under all scenarios, a large adoption of variable renewable energy is expected, but this requires flexible generation technologies such as CSP, which was the major player in our analysis, or batteries if they become the efficient option to replace that. Accelerated decarbonization processes present higher costs, of course, because they are more stringent constraints, but it's not that much. In net present value between $1.2 and $3 billion, we're actually nowadays discussing the creation of a price stabilization fund, which is going to be $2 billion created out of the pocket of the consumers. So paying that extra to phase out coal much faster is not that significant for the Chilean system. The increase in CO2 emissions in the final periods of the planning of the horizon where we don't impose 100% renewables should be addressed, right? Because the final goal is to decarbonize, meaning zero CO2 emissions, not just phasing out coal. So if in the end we see an increase of CO2 emissions because of gas, that's something that should be addressed with a specific policy. We also observe that the use of planning models that do not model flexibility aspects might hide the value of flexibility resources and therefore delay their consideration in relevant policy and regulatory decisions, which is what we observed in Chile since a decade from now, before until now. But now decision makers are realizing about this, and they are pushing forward new measures in terms of new regulation and market adjustments, so that there's a higher motivation in terms of returns for these investments. It becomes then highly relevant to analyze the implications of the flexible resource requirements for decarbonization in the design of regulation and markets. In particular, one thing to observe is price formation. Like, are we setting the price to the actual? There are different ways to set the price of the energy market, accounting for different constraints. So it's important that flexibility constraints are somehow accounted for in the price formation, so that the players that can contribute flexibility get returns on that, get the incentive. And also there are challenges in the effective placement of flexible resources, in particular storage. That's something that we're looking into now, because this model doesn't have the locational aspects, details that allow us to say, okay, this is how much storage we need, but where exactly? For that, you typically need a better modeling of the transmission constraints to see how the flows are going to be distributed in the system. This is just a transportation model for transmission. We need a model that accounts for Kirchhoff laws, right? To decide where. And also there's a decision to make of how big the converter has to be to provide voltage support, and how big does this actual energy storage has to be to provide this flexibility, right? That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for your presentation. I guess we are going to open the floor for questions, but before I do that, I'm going to take the prerogative of being the host and ask a couple of questions. My first question is regarding the statement you made at the beginning, that this is a central planning model. But if I understand, the Chilean market is driven by investments. So how do you factor in the investor in all of this in your model? That's my first question. So I'm going to ask him because we have to share the microphone. The second question was regarding, I guess when you say modeling flexibility, you refer to flexibility constraints, correct? One, if you don't consider them, the model is more flexible, so you end up with different results. My question in that context is, you have to model reserves in all of this. How do you do that? Or how do you do that? How were the reserves considered? And in the same vein, how the uncertainties were considered in all of this.
Okay, so the last one is the easy one. We didn't consider uncertainty so far. Regarding the first question, yeah, I mean, this is central planner perspective. It's still what the National Energy Commission does to project which are the efficient investments so that it can build the transmission to support them, right? So it's a sort of the egg or chicken problem in terms of that even though the central planner, which is the National Energy Commission, doesn't actually decide on which units are going to be built, it sort of signals which units should be built. So the investors are always looking to the central planner results to see if their technology shows up in the plans. And if it doesn't, but they do think are part of the efficient solution, they go on a meeting with the National Energy Commission, show the actual costs, the actual benefits that the technology can provide and are not being modeled in the analysis. So in a sense, we do have a distributed decision-making by private decision, But if the results that we obtain in that market are not similar to what we expect from the central planner perspective, that signals that we need corrections in the market. Or we're doing everything wrong in the model, which is not typically not the case, but it signals that additional incentives are required, or there are incentives or barriers, or maybe identify barriers. Okay, so this should be happening, CSP should be getting into the energy mix. Why is not? If it's clearly part of the efficient solution, why aren't we seeing investments on that? Okay, maybe it's because, and one of the reasons is because we don't have clear rules on how to manage energy storage in the electricity market. It's not clear whether the owner is gonna see when to store and when to supply energy, or is the system operator who's gonna decide. Or maybe the system operator is gonna decide to store a lot of energy for a long period because he's afraid of contingency that might risk the security of the system, but that's not being paid by any ancillary service market or so. So that kind of questions to see why this is not happening if it's part of the efficient solution is what you can aim to answer with that. And regarding your second question, which was the reserves, yeah, well, one thing is that capacity reserves, that's easy to model in a planning model. You just say peak demand plus 13%. I think you're talking about operating reserves, right? Which are, for that, you need to account for whether a unit is on or off. So we do have those constraints, but the binary variable that decides whether the unit is on or off is relaxed. So it's sort of a flavor of that constraint, but it's not strictly enforced. Yeah, we do. By zones, actually, which are the same capacity. Oh, you mean capacity reserves in terms of the, okay, capacity reserves we do. I think that's, I think we used a 15% capacity reserve in the system, but operating reserve, we imposed the same that this independent system operator uses. We define two zones, one in the north and one in the south, and each of them have different operating reserve requirements.
Let me open the floor for questions. Any questions?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks for the nice talk, and I'm glad that somebody is doing something like this for Chilean and hopefully other countries as well. I just have quite a few questions, but I just want to concentrate one or two. One is more a question. So I didn't realize, first of all, I see CSP is not there in Chile according to Wikipedia list of tables. I didn't realize that CSP is so practical yet. So you're putting too much into an imaginary thing, or you think you're confident that it'll be there?
Yeah. So we do have one large power plant, which is a 210 megawatt CSP power plant, which ended up costing a lot actually, and it received some subsidy from state sources for this to happen, because it was the first plant. Is called Cerro Dominador. But then there's one under study, and I think it's a 500 megawatt that it should show up in the system in the next 3 or 4 years. I'm not aware of others, but I'm sure there are also people looking into this investment. I think the investment costs that we use for this estimation are, for this study, are accurate. And I think this is one of the most interesting results, because as I mentioned, we're not seeing it. We're not seeing everybody running studies on where and when and how to install these units. I think the reason is that typically when you install a CSP, you install it with a 18, 15-hour thermal storage, which is a big chunk of the investment. And the incentives for investment in storage weren't that clear 3 or 4 years from now. Now we're implementing a new way of measuring capacity contributions in Chile, which are going to account much better for the contribution of energy storage towards capacity requirements, which is going to mean a higher payment for those capacity payment for those units. And we're also introducing changes into the ancillary service market and changes into the operational protocols for a battery that are changing that condition. So I think we should be seeing much more of these technologies showing up. But after saying that, we have also, after we ran this study, we also observed a very steep drop in the cost of battery energy storage systems. So I think we have to run these numbers again to see if storage plus PV replaced CSP as the efficient option.
Need the microphone. Oh, sorry.
A lot of excess. Sorry, in terms of solar PV, I think my understanding of your work is you're looking at large capacity solar PVs, which if it's possible, that's okay. But on the other hand, I think that far more, let's say, flexible as well as easier to implement is by changing policy that allows like microfit, like they did in Canada, where you allow individuals to install PV plus storage. Now that you know the prices are coming down like crazy, I think you're going to see a completely different situation. So this is something, and of course, while you're doing it, don't forget all of these technologies still have CO2 and other toxic material produced for manufacturing, transportation, and so on and so on. So I don't think you should ignore them, and they're quite significant actually.
Yeah, I think I should have done this presentation last year or so, because we actually accounted for that. We said, after we showed this result, we said the Ministry of Energy, okay, we have to account for distributed generation here. It might be a big player because we're bringing all this power from far north. We're planning on building very expensive HVDC lines, but maybe like plant factors of PV in the north of Chile are the best in the world. But in Santiago, are second best. It's really good, even in the main city. So we did that study actually. I have a presentation here. I can do another seminar maybe in a week from now. We included those as investment decisions from the centralized planner, and we observed something very significant. Is between 40 and 60%, depending on which assumption of cost we take, of the all new capacity we need to build between 2020 and 2040 is distributed in that study. So yeah, we did that analysis, and we also recommended some changes in the regulation for the distribution, electricity distribution sector to make that happen, to allow that to happen.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was curious about, I don't know if you could maybe roughly explain how you model the transmission planning, the transmission expansion, and if you could maybe give us some perspective of how you plan to do it in the more detailed model, because I know that when you're doing the planning for the transmission lines, you could use, for example, I work with GIS, Graphical Information Systems. So you could have a really good sense of what is the route of the transmission lines that you're going to have in your system. So I was wondering if maybe you're planning to use something like that for the next steps. Thank you.
Well, I have one answer for the Chilean case, which makes it much easier because it's very, it's not very meshed. There's only one path for energy from north to south in terms of high voltage transmission lines. So even if we do model transmission with power flow constraints, we're not going to see a big change. We're just going to see the angles of the buses, but the energy has only one way to flow from north to south. It's just along the main corridor. So investment decisions actually, because we weren't creating new load zones. So all the load zones were already there, were growing in size, but were already connected. We didn't have to model new lines, just expansion of the existing corridors. I wouldn't model transmission in more detail in the case of Chile because of this characteristic. In the case of a meshed network, I think we would, like if we want to observe a congestion, I think we would have to go for a DC or even recent approaches of linear relaxations of AC power flows, which we have also tried for the distribution system. Sorry, your second part. I don't know if I addressed your question. Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, so one last question because we're running out of time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. Just a quick question on the EV. Are you considering the impact of like the inclusion of EVs in your models too? Like how is the electric vehicle in Chile? There is nothing happening in that regard, no?
There is a target to increase penetration in 10 times, but 10 times 0 is still 0. We don't have much. We have a very low penetration because basically I think there is interest in the population, but the brands haven't get there yet, right? We don't see Teslas or anything being sold in Chile. We have a couple of companies selling, but penetration is not that big. But it's starting to be a concern for distribution companies which have to plan for EV refueling stations. How do you call that in the charging stations? Yeah, sorry.
And one more quick question for the cost of the generation, especially when you are considering ramping costs, shutdown costs, and those things. I think those information are very detailed. It's not very easy to find the right information, and they're changing from one generation type to another generation type. So have you done anything in that regards to make it more specific to Chilean environment to come up with the cost, which is representative of what's happening over there actually?
Yeah, we were lucky in the sense that in parallel with this study, we were doing a private study for the independent system operator to design the ancillary service market. So they gave us all that information. We had a very detailed information about the minimum up and down times, ramping constraints, and all that for all the units. So this is very representative of the Chilean sector. In some cases where even they didn't have the information for some plants, we got estimates that NREL, I think, published a couple of years ago. Yeah.
So, yeah, we have run out of time. Let me give a chance to the people online to ask any questions. Are there any? If not, yeah, we can have a discussion after this, right? So I just want to officially close the presentation. Thanking Daniel. Thank you for your visit and your willingness to make this interesting presentation. It gives us a lot of information and interesting points of discussion. I have a lot more questions like Pona probably does as well. I also wanted to thank Sana and FIBA for organizing all of this and providing all the support. Thank you very much. And Armugan, which is not, is on vacation, so he's not here. Also thanking him for all his work in setting all of this up. Okay, thank you for attending. There's not more sandwiches outside. I still, if you wanna take a few extra, and very nice seeing you in person. Hopefully we'll have bigger audiences as the pandemic fades out. Hopefully it doesn't come back. Thank you.